Ever feel like people throw around making a difference, but you're kind of left wondering, like, how? How does that actually, happen? Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the career of someone who embodies that phrase, really.
Um,
Baby Cure. He's this incredible fundraiser, the kind of guy connecting donor dollars with, like, actual humanitarian impact on the ground.
and it is way more complex than people realize, honestly.
Oh, I bet.
It's not just, having a worthy cause,
Yeah.
right? You got to understand what makes these donors tick. I mean, we're talking everyone from these giant organizations like USA to like individual people writing checks. You need a strategy, and it's got to work on all those levels.
So it's kind of like, wait, speaking of language of impact, like you got to show these donors how their money, their contribution is actually making a change, right?
Yeah.
A tangible change.
Exactly. And that takes, a special kind of person. What's fascinating about Babakir is he's taken this deep, deep knowledge of global affairs, Middle East, North Africa, that's his wheelhouse, but he's blended it with this really sharp business sense. We can even see this, like, right from his university days at George Mason.
Oh, right. He didn't just study global affairs, did he? He minored in business administration, too. That's not your usual, like, development worker combo.
You got it. And it wasn't just to, like, pad the resume either. I think Babakir, he understood from the get-go, good intentions, sure, but you got to back that up with some serious strategic thinking. And let's be real, you got to get the funding.
It's like he saw that gap,
Yeah.
right, between the people with the resources and the people who desperately, desperately need them. And he was like, okay, I'm going to bridge this.
Yeah, precisely. And he walks the walk early on, too. One of his first gigs was capacity building in Sudan.
Hold on. Capacity building.
Oh.
Okay, got to pause you there for a sec. That's some serious jargon right there.
Yeah.
Break that down for us regular folks.
Sure, sure. Think of it this way. You're an NGO, right? Local group in Sudan doing amazing work, but maybe they're missing some pieces. Maybe it's the organizational side or the financial know-how or even just specific training to make the project really pop. Capacity building is about giving them those tools, those strategies, making sure that impact lasts.
So it's not just about cutting a check. It's about making sure that money's used well,
Yeah.
that it keeps making a difference down the line.
Absolutely. And this early work in Sudan, Babakir's birthplace, by the way, it's a recurring theme, this deep connection he has, although we'll get into this a bit more later, but it's complicated.
Ooh, okay, I see where we're going with this. A little personal connection, maybe a little tension too. This is where things get juicy. But hold your horses. We've got Babak here, armed with these skills, ready to dive headfirst into this whole world of humanitarian funding. What's the next move?
Okay, picture this. You need to got to secure funding, right? Sounds simple enough. But now you're dealing with USAID, which, has its own way of doing things. You've got private foundations, each with their own agenda, and then individual donors, each one with their own expectations. That's Babakir's day-to-day.
Wow, yeah. And I'm guessing he's not just sending out, like, generic applications, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is where I bet that deep understanding of how these donors think comes in.
100%. This isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. It's like he crafts these proposals, and each one, it's got to resonate. He needs to know their priorities, like inside and out, but also be super clear about the impact his project will have.
And he's had some big wins on that front. I mean, his work with grassroots soccer comes to mind straight away.
Perfect example. If anyone's not familiar, they use soccer football, really, to empower young people. I'm talking HIV/AIDS prevention, gender equality, big stuff. Babakir, he's been essential in securing their funding, letting them focus on, well, actually changing lives.
I think what's so cool is how he finds these win-win situations. Donors, they want to see results, obviously, but they also want to feel good about where their money's going. Supporting something like grassroots soccer, it ticks both those boxes.
And that is strategic thinking, my friend. But here's the thing. His expertise, it isn't limited to one organization, even one type of donor. The range of groups he's worked with is crazy global corruption to promoting, like, actual tolerance and understanding, you name it.
Hold on. Don't give me the whole laundry list right now.
Yeah.
Because honestly, while that's impressive and all, I'm more interested in the common thread. What ties all that together?
You're right. Got to pump the brakes. It's not about how many organizations, but the fact that he's able to connect with each one strategically. And that goes back to something so crucial in this line of work. Understanding the nuances, different regions, cultures, ways of making change. It's not a one-size-fits-all world.
Okay, you got me. Tell me more about this strategic thinking. What does that actually look like? Give me the inside scoop.
Well, it's like realizing you can't just have, one approach to making a difference, especially in this field, right? International development. It's not like, oh, this worked over here, let's just plop it down over there. What flies with a private foundation Maybe one focused on, say, women's empowerment in South America, that same strategy. It might fall flat with USID. They've got their own thing going on, their own priorities. And don't even get me started on the bureaucracy.
Okay, yeah, let's dig into that USIE thing a little bit. They're what, like the big kahuna, right?
Yeah.
At least in terms of humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
But I've heard they're kind of notorious for being, well, difficult to work with.
Yeah.
What are some of the hurdles someone like Beabadia, what does he come up against when he's trying to get funding from them?
You're right. USID, they don't exactly have a reputation for being, super adaptable. One thing, just the sheer amount of paperwork, reports, more reports, it's a lot. And then you got to make sure your project fits into their idea of development, their goals. They might be really into, say, agricultural projects in a specific region, right? So if your focus is different, like education or healthcare, suddenly it's an uphill battle just to get them to listen.
So how do you even, like, begin to deal with that? It sounds like you need, like, a PhD in bureaucracy just to get your foot in the door.
Pretty much. And this is exactly where Babakir's whole approach, it just shines. Remember, we were talking about his early capacity building work in Sudan. I think that gave him a major leg up. He saw how NGOs operate, what those challenges really look like on the ground. So he can speak to that, but he also knows how to talk to these big donors, the USAIDs of the world. He speaks their language, the language of impact.
He's like this bridge, right, between what's actually happening on the ground, the reality, and then those high-level policy discussions that, let's be honest, can sometimes feel a million miles away. Speaking of which, we haven't even touched on his work with that think tank, what is the Center for Strategic and International Studies, SIS. That's a whole other level.
Totally. CSIS, major league. We're talking influencing, like, global foreign policy here. And Babakir, he wasn't just getting coffee. He was part of their Africa program, the super selective thing called the Africa Policy Accelerator, I think. The name says it all.
Okay, now that's impressive, but it does make you wonder, how do you go from, like, getting grants for grassroots soccer to advising, policy experts at a place like that? It's like two totally different
Right.
universes.
That's what got me hooked on Babakir's story, to be honest. And I think it comes back to this idea of, like, connecting the dots. He's seen those on-the-ground challenges firsthand, working with groups like Grassroots Soccer, navigating that whole donor maze. So when he gets to the policy table, he's got this perspective nobody else does.
Right, he's not just up in some ivory tower saying, this is what we should do, with no clue how it'll actually play out. He gets it.
Exactly. And that's so valuable, especially with something as complex as, like, the whole African context, which, let's be real, doesn't always get the most nuanced take when it comes to international policy.
Okay, see, now you're speaking my language. You said African context, and I want to dig into that. What are some things that, like, policymakers, especially those, thousands of miles away,
Yeah.
what do they get wrong? And how does someone like Babokir, how does he help them see things differently?
Oh, man, that's a whole deep dive in itself. But for starters, this idea that Africa is like one big monolith, it drives me crazy. Policy people, they often just miss how diverse the continent is. 54 countries, each one with its own thing going on. History, culture, politics, development challenges.
It'd be like talking about, like, European solutions as if Hungary and, like, France have the same needs.
Exactly. And that's where Babikir, with his deep, deep understanding of the region, he becomes so vital. And remember, his connection to Africa, it's personal. Born in Sudan, dedicated a huge chunk of his career to working on these issues. That lived experience, plus his strategic mind. It means he can call out those assumptions, those oversimplifications. He can push for something better, something that actually makes a difference.
It's interesting, though, because you mentioned earlier about his relationship with Sudan being complicated. And I'm really curious to unpack that a bit, because it does feel connected to this whole African context thing. It's one thing to, like, study a place, right?
Yeah.
It's another to have those roots, those ties, but also maybe some conflicting emotions tied up in there, too.
You're hitting on something really important. Now, Babikir hasn't gone into, like, super detail about all of it publicly, but he has mentioned some frustrations, certain things about the culture, the political scene there that rub him the wrong way. And honestly, that's something you see a lot with people in this line of work, especially when they're working in their home countries. Oh, totally. It's like that whole you can't go home again thing.
It's not always that dramatic, but there's truth to it. When it's your home, your people, you see those problems, the injustices, even just the struggles, through a different lens.
That personal connection, it adds this whole other layer.
It does. It does. And it makes you think, how do those experiences, the good and the bad, how do they shape how someone approaches this work? Because international aid development is not just numbers and strategies. It's people's lives.
It really does. It's like, how do you balance that passion, that drive to fix things with, just how hard it can be, and then to feel like you're carrying the hopes of your people on your shoulders? That's a heavy load.
It's like this whole other level of like emotional intelligence he brings to his work. You know, understanding, yeah, development economics, that's one thing, but how it actually lands with people, factoring in the culture, the history, their own experiences, that's different. And that brings us back to Babek here, back to his whole approach.
Hmm.
We talked about like the strategic thinking, navigating those crazy systems, his grasp of the African context.
Yeah.
But what's the common thread? What makes him someone to really watch in this whole world of, changing the world?
To me, he represents this new generation of development rock stars. It's not just passion, not just good intentions. Oh, those are good, don't get me wrong, but they're like masters of the game. They get how international aid works, they get the donors, and they know how to build a narrative that leads to real measurable impact.
Like the diplomats of doing good, right?
Right.
Whether they're in a boardroom talking millions or on the ground working with the community, they can speak both languages.
And what's wild is this new generation, they don't see those as separate things. They get that lasting change. It's got to be both. Connecting the grassroots with the high level policy, the folks with the money to the folks who need it most.
It makes you realize making a difference. It's not just this vague idea, right? It's people like Babbitt here, behind the scenes, making those connections happen, making sure those resources get where they need to go.
And it's on us to celebrate them, recognize what they bring to the table. Because it's often those people, the ones we don't hear about enough, the ones who really understand how change happens, they're the ones making the biggest difference.
This whole deep dive, it's been pretty eye-opening. We started off talking about Babbitt here as this like funding trailblazer,
Yeah.
but honestly, I'm seeing him more as like an architect. He's designing the systems, putting in the work so that real change can actually flow.
And that's a powerful thought to leave people with, because with all the craziness in the world, there are people like him working their tails off to build a better future. And those people, they deserve our attention, our support, and yeah, just our thanks.
So next time you hear some good news, some story about positive change, take a second.
Hmm.
Think about the Babby Cures of the world, the ones making it happen. Because those stories, they don't write themselves.